Third question has to do with the final judgment. And this sort of keys off of what we talked about last month in that Q&A when we were talking about the judgment day. Last month we were talking about, or making the case, that when we die, we actually go into the very presence of God. And so the questioner is saying, well, based on that, what about the final judgment, and how does that mesh with us being in God's presence immediately after we die? Well, we're not going to go back over all the reasons why we were arguing that I believe we do go into the very presence of God when we die. If you want to hear that, just go back on the internet, and you can find that lesson and go over all of that. But if it is true, as we were setting it forth last month, that when we die, we actually do go into the immediate presence of the Lord, then what does that do with Judgment Day? Where does that figure into this whole chronology of things? Why would there even be a day of judgment if those who are the people of God go immediately into his presence? And I think maybe the confusion might be based on a common image that is out there about the day of judgment. That at the end of the world, God is sitting there on his judgment throne. Jesus is the defense attorney just waiting for this long line of people to work their way up to the front in front of the judgment throne. And if one of them happens to be a Christian, then the defense attorney gets up and defends that one. That's not at all a biblical concept of the day of judgment. That's certainly not the story that we get from the story of Lazarus and the rich man. When we read Lazarus and the rich man there in Luke chapter 16, their fates were already sealed. Their fates were sealed at the moment of their death. Lazarus was immediately carried to the place of comfort in Abraham's bosom. And the rich man, immediately, he lifted up his eyes and was in torment. Now, say what you will about the judgment. It seems to me, just based on that they had already experienced a judgment of some kind. I don't know how you could argue otherwise. And that, of course, was in the time when the law of Moses was still in effect. They have Moses and the prophets, Abraham tells the rich man, let them hear them. And so even in that day and time, their fates were already sealed. They knew what their eternal fate was from the moment of death. I was having a conversation with a preacher many years ago about that very thing. And his response was, well, they may not have known their eternal fate. I'm saying, you're saying the rich man may have actually ended up saved on the day of judgment, or that Lazarus may have actually ended up lost on the day of judgment? And he said, well, yeah, possibly. And I said, God, I just don't see that. I just don't see that. The reason the rich man was lost, and he knew it immediately upon death, is because of the way he lived his life. And that wasn't going to change. And the reason Lazarus was saved is because of the way he lived his life, and that wasn't going to change. And so, again, when we think of the day of judgment, we don't need to be thinking of this long waiting line. God doesn't need us to wait in line so that we can plead our case before his throne with having Jesus there to help us out. Remember, Jesus is our mediator right now. He is our mediator. He is the great high priest that stands between us and God and makes it possible for us to even approach God at all. But what do you do, preacher, then with these other passages? And so Hebrews 9 in verse 27, it is appointed unto man once to die, and after that, the judgment. What about Romans chapter 14 and in verse 10? We will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, every tongue shall confess to God. So each one of us will give an account of himself to God. The sister passage to that in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. Well, think about that. Again, Lazarus and the rich man. Did Lazarus receive, using the words from the Apostle Paul, had Lazarus already received what was due for what he had done in his body? And the answer is yes. The rich man, had he already received what was due for what he had done in his body? And the answer is yes, he has. So we're not going to have to wait until the Lord comes again to figure out what our fate is. Did you know there are 8.23 billion people on the planet right now? Over 8 billion people on the planet. If Jesus came today, those 8 billion people would learn of their final fate. And would that more resemble the kind of a judgment throne scene that sometimes we picture? I don't know. It would not be a long wait in line. I'm confident of that. And so what is this great white throne judgment scene that we read about and that is referenced from time to time? I'm not sure that it's the time when people receive their sentence, or maybe they find out why they received the sentence. And I think that is closer to the idea. It is that final explanation of why we received the sentence that we received. And you see that play out clearly in a couple of passages. In Matthew chapter 7, in verse 22, Jesus says, on that day, and he's talking about the day of judgment, on that day, many will say unto me, well, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons in your name? Did we not do many mighty works in your name? Now, it seems like they're pleading their case, doesn't it? Do you think it will have any effect at all on the outcome? I will declare unto them, Jesus says, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. He explains why they received the sentence that they received. Whether they died hundreds of years earlier, or whether they were caught up, or whether they died at the second coming of Christ. They're receiving an explanation of why they are lost. In the other passage in Matthew chapter 25, beginning in verse 31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne, and before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate them one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left hand. Can we just make a very plain observation here? He's gathered all the nations. Yes, all will stand before the judgment seat of God. Even Lazarus and the rich man, who already know their fate, apparently will stand before the judgment seat of God. But notice what God does. They're gathered together, and God immediately does what? He separates them. As a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, he puts the sheep on the right hand, the goats on the left hand. Before a word is uttered, he has passed judgment. Do you see that? The judgment has already taken place. And it just takes place like that. Sheep on this hand, goats on the left hand. And then follows the questioning, why are we on this side? And he says, well, let me tell you why you're on that side. And he explains to them that they had not fed him, they had not clothed him, they had not given him a drink, they had not visited him in prison. And they said, well, when did we ever see you? And he said, it's not just me, it's my children, it's my people. You did it not to the least of these, you did not do it to me. And the same thing with people on the right hand. The reason you're on the right hand is because you did do these things. And so what we see in Matthew 7 and in Matthew 25 is not again, this argumentation before the great white throne, what we see here is an explanation of why the separation has already taken place. And so again, what then would be the purpose of this? What would be the purpose of all the nations being gathered together? Of God separating the sheep from the goats? Why didn't it just do it and then just be done with it? Well, there are a couple of passages, I think, that explain the purpose of what we think of as the great judgment day. One of them is in Romans chapter 2 and verse 5. Romans chapter 2 and verse 5. The Apostle Paul says, it's because of your hard and impenitent heart that you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed, and he will render to each according to his works. He will render to each according to his works, yes. You don't have to wait through ages and ages in the Hadean realm to figure it out. Lazarus and the rich man already figured it out. But at this time, when he renders to each according to his work, God's righteous judgment will be revealed. That God's judgment is a righteous judgment. That he's not the mean God who's looking to try to destroy people. He is not the God who is a God of hate. He's not the God who plays favorites. He is a God who judges righteously. And on the day of judgment, with all the nations gathered before him, his righteous judgment will be revealed. Not just his judgment, who's lost and who's saved, but his righteous judgment. The righteous nature of that judgment will be revealed on that day. And not only vindicates God's righteousness, but it vindicates the lordship of Jesus. Do you remember the passage in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 10? At the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. When do you think that's going to happen? Standing before the great judgment throne of God. The lost are still lost. The saved are still saved. But now everybody knows why. And oh yeah, everybody knows who the real king is. And that will be sealed once and for all on the day of judgment. So, I hope that answers the question.